Welcome back. Welcome to our panel to talk through everything leadership and culture. It's my great pleasure to introduce the panellists. As you can see your pictures up on the screen. We're just talking about having our big pictures on the screen. You'll notice that mine's not there.
Lucky you.
Planning. Tanya Deans, President of Haynes brands we all know and love. So we have Sheridan Bonds Jockey. Tanya's actually been in the rag trade for 30 years, going to bring a wealth of experience to our panel. Lives in Sydney, but was here in Melbourne till 2019. Tanya's really going to bring her passion around the reinvention of brands and how that comes to life, and real role modelling constructive behaviours. And Tanya and the team at Haynes have been working with us for many years now. Mary Lemonis, Chief People and Sustainability Officer, REA Group. Mary and I have known each other a long time. REA, for those who don't know, it's more probably a global technology company nowadays, but we all hit their website regularly.
Hopefully you will do.
Mary's going to talk through her journey of culture and leadership, not only as it relates to people, but also sustainability. And Mary's got a wealth of experience, goes back and might even talk about some of her time with Campbell and Arnott's when she's on stage. And she's been with REA now 5 years?
5.5. Yeah.
5.5 years, time flies. And on the end, who needs no introduction at all, Shaun McCarthy, Chairman of Synergistics Australia and New Zealand, also on the board of directors for HSI and supports us. Shaun's going to bring a wealth of experience, no doubt a few stories. I'm not allowed to say how many years, is that right? Was it? Todd talked about 40 years, so we'll just say 40.
I have my 50th year as a consultant next year.
Yeah.
If I survive that long.
If you survive that long. First trip back to Australia since the COVID times of January 20. So welcome back to the West Islands. So let's get into it. We'll start with you, Tanya. We all heard this about culture and leadership, and so why is culture important to you and to the team at Haynes?
Well, culture is extremely important to me and to the team at Haynes, and I've got a few of my esteemed colleagues here, so they'll hold me to account for everything I say. We've been working at culture for probably a good 10 years now, using kind of the human synergistics tools. And I think the thing that culture provides us is some really good guardrails around expectations of behaviour, leadership. It gives us a good sense of the people we're bringing into the organisation and how they're aligned to kind of what we value. We've done a lot of work over the last 4 or so years on, defining purpose as a kind of a personification, if you like, of everything that we stand for, and we've really embedded that sort of deeply in the organisation, which has really helped us make some tough decisions using purpose and that implicit notion of culture. Whether that's paying our team, our stood down retail team during all of the closures during COVID. Do we pay them a bit? Do we not pay them at all? We've sort of used our purpose to really help us make the right decisions. The same with things like, the sustainability commercial tension that often exists when you're trying to make more sustainable decisions. But sometimes it can cost you a lot of money or a lot of time and effort. And we often use that purpose to really help guide the decisions that we're making. So there's a whole bunch of stuff for us that's really important around behaviours, a whole bunch of stuff around the types of people we're bringing into the organisation, and quite frankly, exiting the organisation too, and then really helping us sort of make some of those decisions that sit somewhere between, what's sort of culturally right and what's appropriate for the business from a performance perspective as well.
Awesome, thank you, Tanya. Mary, culture for you.
Yeah, I'll start with where Tanya went a little bit. And we did this work with Corinne and the team about 3 or 4 years ago now, as we were really trying to be clear about how does it all fit together. And Corinne gave us the analogy of the twin-engine plane and saying that purpose and strategy guides us and culture is what drives us to deliver performance. And it's been such an important way to talk about the role that culture plays. Just like strategy in the twin-engine plane, if one of the engines isn't working, it doesn't work. And so for us, it's been really important to galvanise the organisation around understanding what that is. We've been on a journey for, predates me, but we've really, I think, gone deeper into the OCI space with culture over the last 5.5 years since I've been at REA, with the support of, our 2 CEOs over that time. And I think what's become really clear, and it was really interesting to hear Todd and Peter talk about how do you know what your culture is when people aren't in the building? And it was fascinating because we actually did our full OCI in February 2021, and we're predominantly a Melbourne-based business. We had about 60 or 70 employees that had never actually physically walked into an REA office because they were hired during the lockdown period. And yet their view of our culture when we did the diagnostic was actually even more acute and amplified than people that had actually been in the business for 5 or 6 years, had the benefit of the office. And so if you ever need a data point to show you that, yes, the physical space is important, but we all know culture is so much more than that. It is all the complex things that we do. It's the ways we work, it's the way we're structured, it's the leadership, it's the processes, it's the physical symbols, it's all of those things. And so for us, it's been such an important part of our conversation, and then the conversation we have with our leaders about the impact that they have on culture.
Well, thanks, Mary. Shaun, for you, it's been your lifetime.
Look, I've worked in the field of organisational culture now for, I think, 35 years. And in that time, it's gone from something that's a little bit conceptual, the idea of social norms and assumptions about what's right, wrong, and good and bad, to today, where we can see with Todd and Peter's presentation, and you will see more coming up, the reality that it is everything. And it is, I like Corinne's metaphor, the heartbeat. So you can have a sick heart, you can have a very healthy heart, it affects different aspects of your body, etc. So culture affects everything, and we're getting to the stage now where we have quite a sophisticated understanding of its impact on organisational performance. As DB said in his introduction, it's not engagement. Employee engagement is obviously important, but it's an outcome of culture. It doesn't take us to the root cause. So I'm just going to give 2 answers to, of the many I could, around why culture is important. So one way to think about culture is along these lines here, is that every action is preceded by a thought. So everything we do is a consequence of some thought that's run through. I must raise my fingers towards my face to make emphasis to this crowd, is running through here, leading to that type of action. So the question is, what is the thinking of the people in your organisation as they act, as they interact with each other, as they make decisions, as they solve problems, as they deal with customer problems and issues, etc. So are those thought patterns constructive or defensive, and do they lead to an effective outcome or not? That's the crux of it. The second is economic. We've seen, I want to thank Todd and Peter for their presentation, in particular in this sentence to Todd for the economic aspects of it, because we now have so much research around the relationship between organisational culture and economic performance. So we know, for instance, where we can set up good research projects that, and we measure customer service, the more constructive organisations or branches or divisions, units, will have the better customer service. They'll probably have a higher ratio of profit to sales. They'll probably have higher quality of product, etc., etc. There's also, sitting behind that, the hidden hidden effect of culture. And that's the stuff that we don't actually see on a day-to-day basis. So a very easy example that you'll all be familiar with will be the notion of staff turnover, employee turnover. So ARI, the Australian Human Resources Institute, tell us that in Australia, the average cost of replacing somebody is 1.5 times their salary. We know that the rate of attrition in Australia at the moment is, I think it's 9.6%, so let's make it 10 for the maths so that I don't have to think too hard. So multiply 10 by 1.5 and you've got 15%. So 15% of your payroll walks out the door every year with attrition rates. And so if you can save 10% of that and then take that into the other hidden costs of culture, then personally I could see HR, people and culture, becoming a profit centre in time with cost savings. That's what we see with organisations like councils who are less concerned with growth, etc., but are more concerned with containing costs. We see operational expenditure control being a key aspect and outcome of the work that they do in developing constructive cultures. So on the one hand, just to summarise, on one hand it's what people think, and on the other hand it has dramatic impacts on your organisation's performance.
Thank you, Shaun. Mary, we heard from Corinne, we heard from Todd and Peter, leadership, the role of leadership. Bring us your view of how leadership can help an organisation adapt, lead their culture.
We were presenting to our board about 4 years ago now, I think, and I got asked by one of the board directors when we were showing all our various plans in the people and culture space, look, there's a lot of really interesting things on this list, but if there was only one thing you could do, what would it be? And I was really clear, and we were all very clear, it's invest in our leaders. And by leaders, we mean anyone that manages a person. So not just your senior leaders, but anyone that manages a person. And that really set us on a path of being clear about what our expectations were of that cohort. It's one thing to say you want good leaders, but are we clear about what that looks like? And that really helped shape a way to engage, build capability, make the right choices with our leaders. You know, being a predominantly digital business, you know, you could imagine we've got some technically brilliant individuals who got promoted because they were technically strong, but didn't necessarily have the leadership capabilities. And instead of, you know, jettisoning them, we created pathways, because you need that capability in your business, but you don't need people that aren't good at leadership leading big teams. That's a disaster. And so that created different ways of working for us, different pathways, and it's been a real focus for us. We engage with our people leader cohort on a bi-monthly basis. We focus on building their capability, and it is, I would say, the central thing to what we do. And then I think that's why the tools of the OCI and the LSI are just so powerful, to be able to say to a leader, here's how your team view you, and here is how they view the culture. Can you see the parallels? Can you understand the impact that your style is having on that particular cultural view? So yeah, I would say for us it's paramount, and it sits in our P&C strategy. It sits in the middle of the wheel, surrounded by talent, experiences and sustainability to deliver high performance culture. That's how we talk about it at REA.
Thanks, Mary. Tanya, from your perspective, the role of leadership to adapt and lead and change, potentially from an innovation space.
Yeah, I think, so to build on something that Mary said, I think, you know, constructive leadership, what it does is it unlocks a confidence in leaders that they don't have to have all of the answers. Because quite frankly, the best answers come from deep within organisations. And that plays a very important role in the space of, you know, innovation, because, you know, as I said, leaders, we don't know everything, and we're not necessarily the technical experts. And so I think that's really about unlocking the freedom within a business to have fantastic ideas that bubble up, to really celebrate diversity of thought too, you know, because I think that diversity of thought, and done in a way that's really constructive, because I think, you know, there is good tension and bad tension. And I think if you can create those points of really good tension amongst your leaders, whether they're leaders of large groups or small groups, then the most powerful ideas bubble up. And so, like Mary said, we've got a strategy on a page, and it's really at the top is our purpose, and at the bottom is our sort of behaviour standards, if you like. We don't call them values. We kind of try and convert them into something that's really tangible, like what you see by way of behaviours. And underpinned by that is constructive leadership. So similar, which is probably just a slightly different format, but it is really the foundational piece for everything that we do. We don't always get it right, but we try really, really hard to learn and improve.
Yeah, brilliant. I love that opening line there, you know, that curiosity to explore and the courage to be comfortable not knowing all the answers as a leader. Yeah. Shaun.
Very briefly, I just want to add a little bit to the comment that Corinne made in her presentation this morning, and that is the notion of leaders and leadership. So an extension of the leader culture performance model is the notion that leaders have both a direct and an indirect impact on the organisation's culture. So their direct is quite obvious, that's their behaviour, their role modelling, they're giving permission to people to do certain things, certain ways, etc. There's also the indirect impact, which is the impact of the decisions that I make as a leader, for instance, around organisation structure, around budgeting systems, around accounting, finance systems, around job design, etc. And some of those what we call causal factors that Peter talked about with sanitarium. Never underestimate the power of feedback. I'll tell you a very brief story, if I may. This was again, my stories around consulting obviously are a long time ago. For the last 20 years, I've been pretending to be a manager and a leader instead. But this goes back to working with a general manager of marketing of a fairly large retail banking operation. And this guy is talking to me about his relationship with his staff, direct reports, etc. And he's basically trying to tell me how humanistic and encouraging he is. And he says, you know, so before I sort of head for home at about 7:30 at night, I walk around the office and if there's anybody there, I spend some time chatting to them so that we really feel part of a family. And the joke of the story is the next day I was talking to his direct reports and they said, you know, the bastard comes around at about 7 o'clock at night to check that we're still here. So that person getting some feedback through something like the LSI had to, by definition, be somewhat helpful.
Beautiful, thanks, Shaun. We might stay with you, Shaun. There's a word that's bandied around quite a lot today, which is accountability.
Look, well, accountability is an interesting word. One of the things I learned many years ago is what's called content analysis, which is being able to look at the use of words and associated with their psychological meaning. And strangely enough, accountability is actually a power word. It's not an achievement word, it's a power word. When clients or potential clients talk to me about wanting to hold people accountable for, in my life it's usually around culture change, they sort of say it in a tone of voice that always conjures up this image in my head of medieval torture chamber, where they sort of got my feet over hot coals and they're saying, you will be held accountable. So that's what I mean by a power style statement. So when we look to hold people accountable, we're actually reinforcing the historic culture of the organisation. So better to work on the assumption that if we develop a constructive culture, particularly one that's highly achievement and humanistic encouraging, people will want to take accountability. They won't talk about accountability, they'll talk about commitment and ownership, which is the same word from a different perspective. So, long story short, not a great fan of the word, but be careful how you use it.
Mary.
So when Shaun and I talked in Sydney last week, he couldn't really hear we couldn't hear each other's answers really well, and I answered this one first, and I said accountability is everything. So it was beautiful because, and I think that difference of opinion is important because I think when I answered that, well, I know when I answered that, I was coming at it from the lens of enterprise accountability. And I think unless the enterprise, the business, is willing to put a stake in the ground around what we're trying to do, I think you're really missing a trick. So I buy where Shaun's coming from, which is that sense of individual accountability. Like, you know, I've heard these terrible expressions like throat to choke and, you know, all that sort of stuff. I just go, oh, that's just awful, and not too much of that at REA, fortunately. But I think from an enterprise standpoint, you have to put that stake in the ground. You know, for us, when we did our OCI in 2021, we were really fortunate, and again, this predates me, cultures don't get created overnight, but we have quite a constructive culture at REA, all the constructive styles above the 60th, little bow tie, but pretty much everything below the 50th in the red and the green. But what was interesting for us, or what is interesting for us, is our humanistic encouraging is 87th percentile, which is just off the charts. And you feel it the minute you walk in the door at REA. Everyone wants to help, everyone's interested, everyone's engaged, everyone's curious. However, our achievement is 64th. Not a bad score, but when you look at that and you go, wow, there's a 23 percentage point difference between those two styles. What would REA look like if we were above the 80th in both? And we've achieved a lot. Like if you tracked our sort of share price and our revenue growth to our culture, I think you'd see that nice positive map. But what are we leaving on the table by not having the equal side of that 80-80, if you like? And so that's what we put out as our enterprise accountability, as our calling card. That's what we've said is what we're driving for. And, you know, we'll see where we get to in Feb 2024. You know, if we don't get all the way there, we'll keep on going.
I love that aspirational goal of 80-80, 80 achievement, 80 humanistic. Brilliant, because it'll guarantee self-actualising is going to be there as well. Thanks, Mary.
We could only pick two, so I made a choice.
Tanya.
I love the intent of accountability, but I think the impact can be very different. The way we see it at Haines is, I sort of mentioned this strategy on a page. We've got purpose at the top, standards of behaviour at the bottom, constructive leadership really implicit in that. What we've done with that is we've said, right, well, what is the picture of success? What are goals, which might be stretch goals, and then what does the picture of success look like? And we've developed a scorecard off the back of that. It's probably a little bit too long, and probably some of my team here are going, it's way too long, but we've got a scorecard of measures. And those measures we assess to make sure, a couple of reasons, you know, how are we going with our efforts? But more importantly, I think those measures are all around organisational alignment. And that's kind of how we see it. Are we aligned as an organisation? Are we focusing on the right things, which is a really important part of our, you know, of our underlying culture, I guess, is that sense of alignment. And then what we've done with that is we've sort of rolled that into, I feel like I'm doing a bit of a lesson in how you kind of hold, you sort of cascade KPIs for an organisation. But what we've done with that is we've actually created this thing called roles and goals. So each person in the business actually sets out a group of roles and goals for the next 3 months that cascade up to the enterprise-wide goals and KPIs, if you like. And those roles and goals, yes, are commercial and finance and business, depending on your role, but there's also roles and goals around what leadership are you working on for the quarter and what engagement activity you're working on for the quarter. So it really is kind of this sense of creating that balance between commercial and leadership and personal goals that sort of cascade or ladder up to the overarching organisational intent. And as I said, the thing that I want to underline here is this is really all around alignment and making those tweaks where we have to, supporting the individual to kind of get back on track and see them succeed as an individual as much as the organisation as well.
Love that power of alignment. And you've heard subtly the difference, the power of the words between create ownership, build commitment versus drive accountability and what that can create internally, just in the subtlety of the language. Shaun talked about impact. So we'll go back to you, Tanya. We talked about the impact of the work that you're doing. Describe some of the impact that you've seen to date as a result of the work you've done on culture and leadership.
Well, I think the first thing is just the power of the common language. And we can all talk to parts of the circumplex and, you know, and we're on a journey here, but I guess that sense that people feel much more comfortable in giving each other feedback, and we've got the language to say, hey, felt a bit oppositional, and we sort of all understand really what that means. I mean, I might say at the very start of the journey when we were sort of only referring to red, green and blue behaviour, and only a few of us had done it, you know, gee, that red, green and blue statement can be a bit of a weapon in the wrong hands. So I think it is very important that it is really embedded in the business. But I think it's common language. I think it's holding each of us to account. Didn't say accountable, but each of us to account. It's our ability to see our progress. And yeah, I know culture is an engagement. We do measure engagement twice a year. It's the way in which engagement is an outcome of that deeply held culture, and I know that we've got Sandy, who's head of our P&C, is here today. You know, we're about to see our next engagement score, which really, again, is the outcome of all of that work, and we're getting 95% engagement for every measure, and we've really held that for, I know, the last 4 years or so, and I know that the business is just so excited to see the results of that because of all of that time and commitment we've put into that process.
Congratulations. It's an awesome level of engagement. Mary, what are you seeing? What's the impact of the work to date?
Yeah, so knowing that we've got this 80-80 goal, we've really tried to be clear in all the levers that you can pull, whether it's leadership capability, organisational structure, ways of working, reward mechanisms, to say how are we making sure that desire and drive shows up in each of those elements. Are we doing something from a reward perspective that isn't equally shining a light on both of those things, for example? And so as part of the culture work, what we did was identify 7 particular behaviours that we really wanted to think of as a subset. So we didn't just go with the styles, we actually did discovery interviews, looked at the OCI data to really dig in and understand what were the 5 that were needed to be improved, the 2 that we wanted to maintain. No surprises, collaboration and heart were the ones that were maintained, but things like courage over comfort. How do we, in a business that's largely humanistic, how do you create the permission for people to have those difficult conversations without thinking they're going to ruin the relationship? How do we better prioritise for impact? How do we really make sure that everyone knows our business and understands our business irrespective of their functional lines? And so we articulated those behaviours, we've pressure tested all those different levers to make sure we're allowing for them to show up. And I think what's been helpful for us is, I love the OCI, but you can't do an OCI every month. It's too complex. And so what we've tried to do is take the essence of some of those things that we're trying to change, and we run a monthly culture pulse. We pick 12 statements that align with the OCI behaviours to an extent, and every 3 months we get a statistically significant view of what that worm looks like. So as we go into 24, I'm not sitting there going, has it changed enough? We've actually got a moving target where we can see how we're travelling, and in the last 18 months we've seen from those 5 that we haven't been as strong at sort of increase 10 percentage points. And so I'm hopeful that when we get to our OCI in 24, we'll get closer to where we're trying to go, as opposed to going, I think it's going to be okay. So that's been a really helpful thing for us.
I'm with you. Don't do it every month.
Sorry?
I'm exactly with you the same. Shaun, impact you've seen. I know you've got a story or 2.
Look, our organisational mission statement, as DB said in his introduction, is changing the world one organisation at a time. But every organisation that changes or does nothing, of course, is made up of individual people. So I've always said there's no such thing as, let's just pick an example, Sanitarian, as an organisation. If 1,300 people get out of bed tomorrow morning and said, screw it, I'm not going to work today. I'm not going to work, not just physically going to work, but I'm not going to do any work. So your organisation is a concept that we talk about time and time again, but really it is a bunch of people who do certain things and hopefully do those things well. So beyond that vision, I like to look at the impact that we have on individuals, because you are helping people become their best themselves, you are helping people change their lives. And so at the risk of dropping a tear, I'll tell you a story, because my stories tend to come into my head as I'm thinking and talking. So I generally don't repeat them again, but I dropped a tear when I told the story in Sydney. So my challenge to myself, can I get 2/3 of the way through it rather than halfway through it? So this is again a bank. I did a lot of work in banking from the 80s through to the early 2000s around multiple countries. And I was sitting in my office and the receptionist in Wellington, the receptionist came in and said, there's a young guy out the front wants to talk to you. And I said, who is it? She said, I have no idea. I said, what does he want? She said, I don't know. I thought, well, I said, send him in. What the hell? I was probably doing a crossword or something like that anyway. So anyway, this kid at about 17 or 18 walked into my office and put his hand out and shook my hand. And he said, my name's, whatever it is, Jack Smith. And I just wanted to meet you because my father went through a workshop that you ran for the bank that he works for. And when I turned 14, my father and I stopped talking to each other. And it hasn't been a great relationship. But you did something to that old bastard at that workshop, because he came home and started asking me questions, and it's the first time he's done it for 4 or 5 years. And we now are building a really good parent-child relationship between the two of us. So we are changing people's lives. We are treading on people's souls when we do LSI. Tread warily, because they treadeth on my soul, I've always said to people when I used to run accreditation. So those of you who are accredited practitioners using the likes of the LSI, take ownership of the reality that you are not just helping people become their best themselves, but you're actually helping wider systems within which that individual operates to be the best themselves as well. And you are helping improve people's lives, and we thank you for that.
Great story, Shaun. To bring us home, the power of hindsight, Tanya. And Todd and Peter particularly talked about starting again. So if you were to start again, what would you do differently?
I talk about the 3 or 4 Ps, and they're not the marketing Ps, but I think the first one would be just have patience with the process. You know, it's not an easy road, it's a difficult road. Have patience and be kind to yourself in that journey. I think the second one would be, I hate this word because it came out of COVID, but pivot or persistence. I hate pivot, but anyhow. And that is, you know, organisations, and you know, Todd and Peter talked about this, organisations don't stay steady, and so be prepared as new people come into your business. Corinne spoke about, you know, how individuals contribute to culture, and that heartbeat chart, the top and the bottom of that heartbeat chart, individuals will come in and they'll pressure test the culture. So I think you've got to be, and you know, there's different stakeholders and whatnot. So pivot and persistence, just to constantly be ready to tweak your approach. And I think the third thing for me is just make it personal, because you know, that role modelling thing is so very important, and I think we've heard a lot this morning about really all of this work ultimately starts with your personal journey. So actually look deep. If I sort of had to tell myself again what I do, I'd say look deep within yourself, look at what you need to change, and then role model that change, because that role modelling and that powerful personal stuff is really, really contagious.
Love it. Love the Ps. Mary.
Look, I've got to double down. I think that for things to change, first I must change. You've got to really start there for all of us. It's very easy to look at everyone else and go, what should they be doing differently? All you can really control is yourself. So I think, you know, you can never do that enough, I think. And I really loved Corinne's use of the word improvise. I was in the green room in Sydney, so I didn't see her presentation last week. But I think be okay with that, because sometimes I think when we are in that mode, we're like, oh, are we not staying the course? Are we, you know, but you have to, that's part of the job. You have to be really engaged in that improvisation. You have to have a deep sense of where you're trying to go, but you have to be prepared to shift along the way of that path.
Thank you. Shaun, wind the clock back.
Time. I agree very much with what Tanya said around, I think the word you used was patience. One of the things that I've learned in my own desire to help create change in organisations as quickly as possible is it does take time, it does require patience. And everybody in every organisation learns its own things in its own time and its own speed. And so if you roll with that, rather than trying to push against what might seem to be initial resistance, make that initial resistance the first adaptation process to the change agenda. So the old saying is good things take time, and they do.
Thank you. I think, you know, I'm going to steal from Tanya. Patience, persist, personal. Can you please thank our panellists, Tanya Deans, Mary Lemonis and Shaun McCarthy.